Hello my darlings, welcome back to the Audiotent YouTube channel. I am your host, Mr. Alfonso Muchacho, and today we shall be learning all about EQ. What more can there be to say about EQ? Well, quite a lot. It's easily the most fundamental and important technique to understand when learning to produce incredible, life-changing music. Think about how much better Beethoven would have been if he'd have understood parametric EQs properly. The mind boggles. One thing that a lot of people struggle with is choosing the right EQ for the right job. There is a lot of choice out there. Essentially, they all sound the same unless they're doing analog emulation. There are very slight differences, but you've got to do a null test to hear if there's a slight difference between a parametric EQ. And I'm going to say if you have to do that, then the difference is minute. So you could be forgiven then that just use the EQ you like on everything. And I've done this a lot. 90% of my work is done with Ableton's EQ8, but we shouldn't be ignoring all the different varieties out there, as they all have a time and a place. As ever, Muchacho has made a demo track to demonstrate our teachings and our learnings on. Here it is. The bassline is from Diva, and it's the Astro preset found within the Division Deluxe preset pack. The pluck is from the Voltage preset pack. And the percussion is made up of loops from the Glitch and Gradient sample libraries. And together it all sounds like this. So first up, let's start with probably the most useful type of EQ, the parametric EQ. A parametric EQ is a multi-band variable equalizer. This means that it allows you to control each band's amplitude, frequency, and Q, or bandwidth. You are able to boost or cut amplitude, move the frequency, and widen or narrow each band's bandwidth. The most common one is usually the one you have within your DAW, and these EQs are great for nearly everything. You can be as surgical or as broad as you like and use it on everything from a single instrument to an entire mix. There are a lot of popular choices out there, including ones from Waves and FabFilter. Waves have their HEQ, which muddies the waters a bit as it offers console emulations for the different EQ bands. This kind of goes against the super clean and transparent nature of most of these EQs, but it's worth checking out a few different options as they do have slightly different sounds. But to be honest with you, you're probably better off choosing the one that you enjoy working with the most. The best looking one, or the simplest controls, as it's very hard to actually hear a lot of difference between parametric EQs. I'm being completely honest here, and I won't pretend, like some other so-called YouTubers, that I can tell which type of parametric EQ I'm using by squinting or looking at the speaker. To me, they all sound so similar. I go by what I like to use, and Live's EQ8 with oversampling turned on sounds great to me. Next up is probably the most controversial of EQ types. Yes, there's even controversy about EQs, and that's the linear phase EQ. So, full disclosure, I'm of the opinion that these aren't necessary and probably cause more problems than they solve, but you might feel differently. To understand what they do, you need to first understand something about all other EQs that may or may not be labelled minimum phase EQs. These tend to be any EQs that you're using. Don't worry too much about the label, but just know that nearly all of these equalizers experience phase shifts due to the latency created from changing the amplitude of specific frequency bands. This latency or delay of the frequencies causes what's known as phase phase smear. So phase smear will leave very small artifacts in your track, but mostly you won't be able to hear it. Have you ever even noticed this before I mentioned it today? Probably not. But linear phase EQs are EQs that do not alter the phase relationship of the source. The phase is entirely linear. These type of EQs can be used by mastering engineers due to their precise nature and the lack of smearing. But there is a big problem with them, and that's pre-ringing. Pre-ringing is where you hear the transient before the transient hits. It's a very irritating sound when you notice it. I used to try linear phase EQs on my entire mix, often when cutting the low end, but what would happen is I'd hear the click from my kick just before the real transient hit, and it drove me up the wall. The way I view these EQs is I've never been annoyed by smearing, but I have been annoyed by pre-ringing, so I just avoid them completely. Okay, so next up is a type of EQ that isn't really a type of EQ, but I don't care. It's my video and I make the rules. I'm naming them analog emulation EQs. The reason why this will annoy a few people is that an analog EQ could be any type of EQ. Well, not a linear phase EQ, that's impossible, but an analog EQ could be a parametric EQ, a graphic EQ, a mid-side EQ, etc. But as we're talking about in-the-box EQs, I'm lumping all the analog EQ emulations together. So what sets these EQs apart from all the other EQs is that they're not trying to be transparent. In fact, they're trying to be the opposite. They're adding colour to your sound. Colour is, of course, saturation or pleasant artifacts. The reason why I enjoy using some of these isn't because they give some magic mojo or any other buzzword, it's because of their limitations. For years I forced myself into using the VEQ4 across a lot of my elements. The VEQ4 is an emulation of a classic Neve EQ. It sounds good, as good as anything else. What I enjoyed was the limiting controls. I could only make a certain amount of adjustments to the sound. This is desirable across a group as I have it set up here because I want gentle shaping EQ adjustments, not surgical ones. Having something like a parametric EQ here gives me the opportunity to change everything. Every conceivable band can be adjusted into oblivion, and having limitations like you see here stopped me from going too insane. Okay, next up is a relatively new type of EQ, and that's dynamic EQ. Dynamic EQ is a little bit like an EQ crossed with a multi-band compressor. It's a tool that allows you to apply equalization changes only when a certain threshold is reached. Using these types of EQ, you can selectively apply EQ changes only when they're needed, rather than affecting the tonal quality of the track for the entire song. This, in theory, makes sense across an entire mix. You might want to EQ out a harsh hi-hat, for example, but by dropping the EQ a few dB, you are altering the entire mix, even when that hi-hat isn't playing. Dynamic EQ allows you to EQ only the track when the sound is playing, thus leaving the rest of your mix unaffected. In essence, a dynamic equalizer allows you to EQ the louder parts of your track, or more precisely, the louder parts of any particular frequency in the track, differently than the quieter layer just under it. In the two examples I have here, Surfer EQ is kind of the true dynamic EQ. You set it much in the same way that you would set up a multi-band limiter, and then sit back and marvel as it dances around, cutting or boosting specific notes and frequencies as they're played in your track. The second example I have here is Goldfoss, which isn't so much of a dynamic EQ, but more of a dynamic AI EQ. Of course, the term AI is complete nonsense, but that's how they've branded it. It looks very simple, but it's deceivingly complex, and it's based on a model of human auditory perception. This adjusts the EQ curve of the signal being processed in a dynamic way to maximize clarity according to your parameter settings and the nature of the input signal. So, in a way, it knows what you like to hear and matches your signal to make it sound pleasant. It performs hundreds of adjustments per second, so it can really be a powerful tool. You have some control over it. You can specify whether you want it to prioritize boosting or cutting, and whether to have a preference for brighter or darker mixes, but that's pretty much it. The rest is done by the Skynet brain. My personal feelings on these type of EQs is that they're great for mixing and mastering engineers. They can fix problems in mixes that cannot be fixed by static EQs, enabling an engineer to tame an annoying sound without having access to the source material. However, for producers, I think they hold less value and may even encourage laziness. If you have a really annoying sound in your track, it's a mistake and you should go back in and fix it at the source. Applying a band-aid to your entire mix is never the best solution, and you shouldn't rely on clever tools such as these to do it for you. That being said, a gentle application across an entire track can help bring out some air in your mix. Goldfoss is particularly useful for adding a bit of pleasing high end. The last type of EQ that I want to cover today is mid-side EQ. Oh, that's boring, muchacho. I already know all about that. I hear you cry through the load balancers and the tier 1 providers of the internet. Well, that may be true, Kimosabi, but in muchacho's humble opinion, this is the most overlooked and underused type of EQ in existence. Many times muchacho will receive a track for mastering and it's panned dead center. Almost the entire mix is straight down the middle, and I shout from the rooftops about how irritating it is and that people are too lazy to pan their channels. Well, the same can be said for mid-side EQ. How often do you flip the EQ onto mid-side mode? Go on, be honest. The little switch over there on the far right of the Sheps EQ, or that little mode button on the EQ8? Never. I thought so. People always look for new plugins to make their mixes sound wider when they have the golden ticket sat right in front of them. A bit of panning and mid-side EQ can transform your mix entirely. There's even another button here that you're ignoring, and that's the one that lets you EQ the left and right channels independently. The great thing about this is it can make mono signals wide without throwing them out of phase. This is particularly useful on hardware mono synths, where you love the sound, but you just don't want it to be, well, so mono. EQ the left and right sides independently and you'll magically get a wider sound. Do this on every element and suddenly your mix is wider and you didn't need to use a stereo widening plugin at all. Okay, you've got to be subtle when using it across your entire mix like I did there, because I'm a madman, but on individual parts like this bass line, it makes a subtle but welcome difference. So to sum up, the 5 types of EQ I covered are parametric, and you use that on everything; linear phase, you use that on nothing; analogue emulation, use them across entire mixes or groups of tracks; dynamic EQ, use them if you really messed up; and finally mid-side EQ, use them as much as you can, but show some restraint on anything that should be straight down the middle, like the kick or bass lines that are under 100 Hz. So I hope you find this useful. If you're someone that likes using linear phase EQ, please do not feel the need to chase me across the internet in a fit of rage. One last muchacho top tip before we go though. Don't run out and buy all these different types of EQs. You only really need to have 1 or 2. They all pretty much do the same thing, and you'll be hard pressed to hear what someone's used in a finished track anyway. Concentrate on saving your money.